Let me start by saying that I genuinely love my job. Well, most days I do. Working the night shift at Riverside General isn't for everyone, but the pay is decent, and the benefits package is hard to beat. Health insurance that actually covers everything, generous paid time off, and hazard pay that rivals anything you'd find in the private sector. All of this comes with one significant caveat. Our patients aren't exactly human. I should clarify, we do treat humans. That's what the first 4 floors are for. Riverside General looks like any other hospital from the outside, and for the most part, it functions like one too. But if you have the right clearance to take the service elevator past the basement level, that's where things get different. Sublevel 1 through 3 is where we treat what the hospital administration officially calls non-standard biological entities. Those of us who work there just call them the night folk. Vampires, werewolves, shapeshifters, and other creatures that go bump in the night. They need medical care too, and Riverside is one of only 7 facilities in the country equipped to provide it. I've been working as a nurse on sublevel 2 for the past 3 years. It's usually the werewolf ward, though we get the occasional shapeshifter or were creature variant. My background was emergency medicine before this, which is apparently perfect for dealing with beings that can accidentally disembowel you during a panic attack. 3 years in, and I still have all my fingers and major organs, which is more than some of my colleagues can say. The thing about working with night folk is that everything is protocol. Every creature has specific handling procedures, and every situation has a pre-established response. Break protocol, and best case scenario, you end up with a write-up. Worst case, well, let's just say we've had a few closed casket funerals. The main rules are posted everywhere, and they're simple enough. Never enter a patient room alone. Always wear your marker bracelet while on shift. Follow all posted containment protocols for each ward. If you hear Code Crimson announced, proceed immediately to the nearest safe room. Never, under any circumstances, administer medication not explicitly approved for a specific species. Simple enough, right? That's what I thought too, until last Monday when they brought in patient 34B. I was working my usual night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Things had been quiet. A werewolf with silver poisoning, a vampire with severe sunlight burns, and a shapeshifter stuck halfway between forms. Standard stuff. Then the emergency intake alarm blared. Dr. Bowman rushed past the nurse's station, pulling on a hazmat suit. "Bobby, I need you now. We've got a code yellow coming in." Code yellow. Something new. Something they didn't have established protocols for yet. I should have called in sick that night. I really should have called in sick. Because what they wheeled in wasn't like anything I'd seen before. And what followed changed everything I thought I knew about our hospital, the night folk, and the rules we're supposed to follow. Some rules I learned aren't meant to protect us from the patients. Some rules are meant to protect us from the hospital itself. The thing they wheeled in was wrapped in a thick, dark tarp that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 4 security guards flanked the gurney, each one gripping the metal frame tight enough to whiten their knuckles. I could hear something moving under the tarp, a wet, sliding sound that made my skin crawl. "Bobby, get the isolation room prepped, now!" Dr. Bowman barked, his voice muffled through the hazmat suit. I scrambled to my feet and headed for room 13, our highest security containment area. As I punched in the code, I noticed my fingers were trembling. I'd never seen Dr. Bowman this agitated before. The man had once calmly stitched up a thrashing werewolf during the full moon without breaking a sweat. Something was very wrong. Room 13 had special features the other rooms didn't. Silver-reinforced walls, UV light options, and a complete oxygen lockdown system. I grabbed the tablet mounted outside the door and began the sterilization sequence. "Hang tight, Bobby," came Marge's voice from behind me. Marge Wilkins was the night charge nurse, a tough-as-nails woman in her 50s who'd been at Riverside since the special units opened. You're gonna need to see the special handling sheet for this one. Marge handed me a red folder. Red, not the usual yellow or blue. I'd never seen a red folder before. What's coming in? I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Something from the quarry outside of town. Construction crew found it while blasting for the new highway expansion. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. It already killed 3 people during transport. My stomach dropped. Why didn't they take it to sub-level 3? That's where we kept the really dangerous ones. Sub-level 3 is where they found it, Marge replied, her expression grim. Apparently it escaped from there about 30 years ago, before my time. Before I could ask any more questions, the double doors at the end of the hall burst open, and the gurney came rolling in, Doctor, Bowman, and the security team moving fast. The tarp was writhing more violently now, and I swore I could hear whispering coming from underneath it. Room prepped? Dr. Bowman asked sharply. I nodded, stepping aside as they pushed the gurney into room 13. The whispering grew louder as they passed, and though I couldn't make out any words, my nose started bleeding. I wiped it away, hoping no one noticed. Read the protocol, Nurse Roberts. Dr. Bowman called over his shoulder. We'll need to administer the initial sedative within the next 4 minutes. I flipped open the red folder and started reading. Patient 34B. Classification. Extreme containment appearance. Humanoid. Will attempt to mimic familiar faces. Do not trust visual identification. Special handling procedures. 1. Patient must remain in complete darkness at all times. Any exposure to light causes agitation and attempted escape. 2. Staff must wear sonic dampeners when in proximity to patient. Patient can influence thoughts through vocalization. 3. Only staff wearing approved marker bracelets may enter containment. Non-marked personnel will experience disorientation and may become susceptible to influence. 4th patient requires chemical sedation every 4 hours. Exactly. Use only compound RT7, see cabinet 3. Dosage, 50 cc 5. In case of breach, activate code Crimson and proceed to nearest safe room. Do not attempt to subdue patient. 6. Never look at patient for more than 10 seconds continuously. 7. If patient speaks your name, exit room immediately and report to supervising physician. I just finished reading when Joe Blackburn, one of the security guards, stumbled out of room 13. His nose was bleeding profusely, and his eyes looked unfocused. It knows my name, he slurred, grabbing my arm. It shouldn't know my name, Bobby. It said my mama's name, too. Before I could react, Joe's eyes rolled back and he collapsed, foam bubbling at the corners of his mouth. I hit the emergency call button as doctor. Bowman emerged from the room. Damn it! Get the crash cart! He shouted, dropping to his knees beside Joe. I darted to get the crash cart while Marge called a code blue. By the time I returned, Joe's body was convulsing violently, his back arching at an impossible angle. Then, to my horror, dark, thread-like tendrils began seeping from his ears, nose, and the corners of his eyes. Get back! Dr. Bowman yelled, scrambling away from Joe's body. Isolation protocol! Joe's body went rigid, then collapsed completely. The dark threads retracted, disappearing back into his body. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. What just happened? I whispered, my voice shaking. Dr. Bowman stood up slowly, removing his hazmat hood. His face was ashen. It made contact. Rule number 7, Bobby. It spoke his name. But what is it? I asked. Something old, Dr. Bowman replied, his voice heavy. Something that was here long before us. They found it back in '89 during the original hospital expansion. They thought they could study it, contain it. Then the incident happened. What incident? The one that's not in any of the official records. Marge cut in. The one where we lost an entire medical team and had to seal off part of Sub-Level 3. Dr. Bowman nodded grimly. I need to call Director Holt. Bobby, get the paperwork started for Joe. And for God's sake, make sure your marker bracelet is secure. I glanced down at the plastic band around my wrist, the strange symbols etched into it glowing faintly blue. I'd always thought they were just RFID trackers. What exactly do these do? I asked, holding up my wrist. Dr. Bowman paused at the door. They mark you as you, the real you, so it can't replace you. He left me standing there staring at Joe's body, the implications of his words sinking in like ice water through my veins. Marge touched my shoulder gently. Come on, Bobby. Let's get you some coffee. You look like you've seen a ghost. Not a ghost, I muttered, still staring at the closed door of room 13. Something worse. As we walked away, I could swear I heard my name being whispered from behind that door. Soft, insistent, and somehow familiar, like an old friend calling me home. Marge and I sat in the break room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. I cradled a cup of coffee between my hands, more for warmth than caffeine. My body felt cold from the inside out. You've been here 3 years and never asked about the bracelets? Marge raised an eyebrow, stirring sugar into her own cup. I fingered the plastic band around my wrist. I just figured it was for access control or tracking, like a fancy ID badge. It's that and more, Marge said, her voice low despite us being alone. The markers contain a compound that resonates with human bioelectricity, creates a kind of signature that can't be copied. Copied by what exactly? I asked. Marge took a long sip of her coffee. There are things out there that don't just kill you, Bobby. They become you, like that thing in room 13. Before I could ask more questions, my pager buzzed. Dr. Bowman wanted me back at room 13. My stomach knotted as I stood up. Keep your bracelet visible at all times, Marge warned as I headed for the door. And remember rule number 6, don't look at it for too long. Walking back to room 13 felt like wading through quicksand. The usual nighttime noises of the hospital, beeping machines, distant conversations, the occasional howl from the werewolf ward, seemed muted, overshadowed by a strange tension in the air. Dr. Bowman was waiting outside the room, talking in hushed tones with a woman I'd never seen before. She was tall, with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a severe bun, wearing a charcoal pantsuit that screamed, "Government official." "Bobby, this is Director Holt," Dr. Bowman said as I approached. "She's the head of special containment for all 7 facilities." Director Holt barely acknowledged me, her gray eyes scanning my face with clinical detachment. "You've read the protocol?" she asked, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. We need to establish a continuous monitoring rotation. Dr. Bowman tells me you've had experience with high-risk patients." I almost laughed. High risk to me meant aggressive werewolves or hungry vampires, not whatever this was. "I've handled my share," I replied cautiously. "Excellent. You'll be paired with Nurse Wilkins for the first shift. 4 hours on, 8 off. The patient requires sedation every 4 hours precisely." She handed me an access card. "This will open cabinet 3 in the med room. The sedative is stored there. Only authorized personnel can access it." "What exactly is in the sedative?" I asked. Director Holt and Dr. Bowman exchanged looks. "It's a proprietary compound," Dr. Bowman said finally. "Developed specifically for this patient." "Nurse Roberts," Director Holt cut in, "what you're dealing with is classified at the highest level. You don't need to know what's in the medication. You just need to administer it correctly and on schedule." I nodded, knowing better than to push further. "Yes, ma'am." "Initial sedation has already been administered," Dr. Bowman explained. "Your first dose will be at 3 a.m., not a minute before, not a minute after." "One more thing," Director Holt added, handing me something that looked like a small hearing aid. "This is your sonic dampener. It goes in your right ear only. Do not remove it while in the room. Do not allow the patient to touch it." I slipped the device into my ear. Immediately, the sounds around me became slightly muffled, as if I were underwater. "The patient may try to communicate with you," she continued. "It may plead, threaten, or offer information. Ignore it. Document anything it says, but do not engage." "What if it says my name?" I asked, remembering Joe. "Exit immediately and report to me," Dr. Bowman said firmly. "No exceptions." After a few more instructions and warnings, they left me to wait for Marge. I stood outside room 13, staring at the closed door, wondering what exactly waited for me on the other side. Marge arrived 15 minutes later, looking refreshed after changing into clean scrubs. "Ready for this?" I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. "Remember," she said as she entered the access code, "Rule number 6, no extended eye contact." The door hissed open, and we stepped into the anteroom, a small space with another sealed door ahead, and decontamination equipment lining the walls. Marge handed me a tablet. "We'll be recording vitals every 30 minutes, she explained. "The patient is fitted with remote monitoring equipment, but we need visual confirmation as well." "How do we see it if the room has to be kept dark?" I asked. In answer, Marge handed me a pair of night vision goggles. "These filter certain wavelengths. The patient perceives it as darkness, but we can see." We put on the goggles, and Marge entered another code on the inner door. It slid open with a soft, pneumatic whoosh. The darkness inside was absolute. Even with the goggles, I could only make out vague shapes at first. The hospital bed in the center of the room, monitoring equipment along the walls, and a dark mass lying unnaturally still on the bed. We stepped inside, and the door closed behind us with a definitive click. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the hospital. My breath came out in visible puffs. "Patient appears stable," Marge whispered, moving to check the monitors. "Vital signs within established parameters." I approached the bed cautiously, tablet in hand. Through the green-tinted view of the night vision goggles, I could now see what lay on the bed, and my blood turned to ice. It looked human, mostly. A man in his 40s, with sandy brown hair and an unremarkable face. But there was something wrong about the proportions, like someone had tried to build a human body from memory and got the details slightly off. The fingers were too long, the shoulders too narrow, the eyes snapped open and locked onto mine. They were completely black, like polished obsidian, and seemed to absorb the limited light from the monitors. I immediately looked away, remembering rule number 6, 10 seconds, no more. "Hello, Bobby," it said, the voice surprisingly normal, pleasant even, like a friendly neighbor greeting me over a fence. I felt Marge tense beside me. "Do not engage," she murmured. "That's not very polite, Marge," the thing on the bed said, its voice taking on a hint of amusement. "Bobby and I are just getting acquainted." I focused on the tablet, refusing to look at the patient again. My hands were steady as I entered the vital signs from the monitor, but inside my heart hammered against my ribs. "You're not what I expected," it continued. "Last time I was here, the staff was much older. Dr. Harrison was in charge then. Is he still around?" Marge continued her checks in silence. I followed her lead, moving to check the IV drip that presumably contained whatever kept this thing sedated. "He's not, is he?" the patient mused. None of them are. Such a shame what happened. All those brilliant minds, gone in an instant. My curiosity piqued despite my fear. Was it talking about the incident doctor Bowman mentioned? The lost medical team? As if reading my thoughts, it chuckled. Oh, they didn't tell you about that? About what I did to them? Or rather, what they did to themselves once I was inside their heads? That's enough, Marge said sharply. Nurse Roberts, check the restraints, please. I moved to examine the thick metal cuffs that secured the patient to the bed, wrists, ankles, and another band across its midsection. Each restraint glowed faintly with the same blue light as our marker bracelets. As I leaned over to check the wrist restraint, the patient turned its head slightly toward me. I kept my eyes averted, focusing on the task. I know what you dream about, Bobby, it whispered, so quietly that I wasn't sure Marge could hear. Those nightmares about drowning, about the lake where your brother died. I was there, you know. I saw everything. A cold spike of fear shot through me. No one knew about those dreams. I'd never told anyone about them, not even my therapist. I could bring him back for you, it continued, its voice slithering into my brain despite the sonic dampener. Would you like that? To see little Tommy again? I stumbled back from the bed, my heart racing. Marge grabbed my arm, steadying me. It's lying, she said firmly. That's what it does. It gets in your head and finds the things that hurt, then uses them against you. The thing on the bed laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across concrete. Am I lying, Bobby? Or have I just been waiting for you all these years? Someone who could understand what I really am. Someone who could help me. We're done here, Marge declared, pulling me toward the door. Initial check complete. As the door closed behind us, I heard it call out one last time. See you at 3 a.m., Bobby. We have so much to talk about. I yanked off the night vision goggles, blinking in the harsh light of the anteroom. My hands were shaking now. What the hell was that? I gasped. How did it know about my brother? Marge's face was grim as she removed her own goggles. That's what it does. It gets inside your head, finds the weak points. But my brother? I never talk about him. Never. It doesn't need you to talk about him, Marge replied, her voice softening. That's why we have the dampeners, but they're not perfect. The longer you're exposed, the more it can access. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. I have to go back in there in 4 hours. Alone. Not alone, Marge corrected. You'll be with Clint from security. Nobody goes in there solo. Rule number 1, I muttered. Never enter a patient room alone. Marge nodded. That rule exists for a reason, especially with patient 34B. The hours crawled by, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. I tried to focus on my regular duties, checking on the werewolf with silver poisoning in room 4, changing the IV bag for the vampire in room 7, but my mind kept drifting back to room 13 and what waited for me there. You look like hell warmed over, Billy Jenkins commented as I changed the dressing on his silver-burnt arm. Billy was a local mechanic who happened to be a werewolf. He'd gotten into a fight with some drunk hunters who'd shot him with silver buckshot. Something going on down here tonight? Just a complicated new admission, I replied, careful not to share details. Billy's nostrils flared slightly. Werewolves could smell fear, and mine was probably coming off me in waves. Must be something real nasty, he said, eyeing me curiously. You weren't this jumpy when I came in last full moon and nearly took your arm off. I managed a weak smile. That was just you being you, Billy. We're used to werewolves around here. But not used to whatever's got everyone walking on eggshells, he observed. Even Dr. Bowman looks spooked, and that man has ice in his veins. I finished taping the fresh bandage and moved to record Billy's vitals. You should get some rest. That silver's still working its way out of your system. Billy grabbed my wrist, his grip firm but not threatening. Word of advice, Bobby? Whatever it is, don't let it smell your fear. Predators always go for the scared ones first. I nodded, grateful for the advice even if I doubted it would help with patient 34B. Whatever that thing was, it went beyond simple predator-prey dynamics. By 2:30 a.m., I was in the medroom, accessing Cabinet 3 with the special card Director Holt had given me. Inside was a single vial of cloudy greenish liquid and a sealed, sterile syringe. The label on the vial simply read RT7 with today's date. "That's some nasty-looking stuff," came a deep voice from behind me. I turned to see Clint Reeves, the night security guard assigned to accompany me. Clint was built like a linebacker, with broad shoulders and arms thick as tree trunks. His dark skin was covered in intricate tattoos that disappeared beneath his uniform sleeves. Protection symbols, I'd heard, though I'd never asked him directly. "They tell you what's in it?" he asked, nodding at the vial. "Proprietary compound," I replied, repeating what Dr. Bowman had told me. Clint snorted. "That's admin speak for you don't want to know." I carefully measured 50 cc of the green liquid into the syringe. It was viscous, moving slowly like cold honey. "You've dealt with patient 34B before?" "Not directly," Clint said, his expression darkening. "But I was here during its last containment, 20 years ago." I looked up, surprised. I thought it escaped 30 years ago. It did. They recaptured it about 10 years later, kept it here for nearly 8 months before the incident happened. He tapped his marker bracelet meaningfully. These weren't standard issue back then. A lot of people died because of that oversight. My mouth went dry. How many is a lot? 23 staff members, Clint said quietly, plus 4 patients who were caught in the crossfire. It replaced them one by one over weeks. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it had already spread too far. I finished preparing the medication with slightly trembling hands. And now it's back. "Now it's back," Clint agreed grimly. "And honestly, I'd rather face 100 pissed-off werewolves than go into that room." That wasn't exactly comforting coming from a man who looked like he could bench press a car. "But we've got better containment now," he added, probably seeing the fear on my face. "Better protocols. Just stick to the rules and we'll be fine." We walked to room 13 in silence, the only sound the soft squeaking of our shoes on the linoleum and the distant moans from the shapeshifter ward. I checked my watch. 2:53 a.m. Still a little early, but we needed time to suit up. Dr. Bowman was waiting for us outside the room, reviewing data on a tablet. "Right on time," he said, looking up. "Any issues with the medication?" "No, sir," I replied, showing him the syringe. "Good. Remember, exactly 3 a.m., not a minute before or after." He handed me a fresh sonic dampener. "Replace your current one with this. They need to be changed every 8 hours." I swapped out the devices, the hospital sounds momentarily rushing back to full volume before becoming muffled again. "I'll be monitoring from the observation station, Doctor." Bowman continued. "If anything, and I mean anything, seems off, activate the emergency call button and get out." Clint and I nodded in unison. Dr. Bowman gave us one last appraising look before heading to the observation room down the hall. "Ready?" Clint asked, his hand hovering over the keypad. I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready, but I nodded anyway. As I'll ever be. We entered the anteroom and donned our night vision goggles. The clock on the wall read 2:57 a.m. 3 minutes, I said. holding the syringe carefully. Clint checked his taser, standard issue for security, though I doubted it would do much against whatever waited for us. Remember, no direct eye contact for more than 10 seconds. And if it says my name, exit immediately, I added. No matter what, Clint emphasized. Even if I'm down, you get out. Clear? Clear. At exactly 2:59, Clint entered the code for the inner door. It slid open silently, revealing the pitch-black room beyond. Through my night vision goggles, I could see patient 34B lying on the bed, just as before. It appeared to be sleeping, its chest rising and falling in a regular rhythm. We stepped inside, and the door sealed behind us. The temperature seemed even colder than before, the air heavy with a metallic smell that reminded me of old pennies. Patient 34B, I announced, keeping my voice professional. It's time for your medication. The thing on the bed opened its eyes slowly. Through the green tint of the goggles, those black orbs looked like holes in reality. Bobby, it said, its voice somehow both sleepy and alert. Right on time, and you brought Clint with you. Hello, Clint. It's been a while. Clint stiffened beside me, but remained silent, positioning himself between me and the door as I approached the bed with the syringe. You've grown since I last saw you, the patient continued, addressing Clint. You were just a security trainee back then, so young and frightened. Do you still dream about what you saw that day in the morgue? I focused on prepping the IV port, refusing to look at patient 34B's face. My hands were steady now, the familiar routine of administering medication taking over. The silence treatment? How rude, it sighed, especially when I have so much to offer you both. I checked my watch, 2:59:45, 15 seconds to go. You know, Bobby, it said conversationally. Your brother didn't die instantly when he drowned. Did they tell you that? He was conscious under the water for nearly 2 minutes, calling for you, wondering why you didn't jump in to save him. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to watch the seconds tick by. 2:59:50, 51:52. And Clint, it continued. What would your husband say if he knew what you really did during the containment breach? The choices you made? The people you sacrificed? From the corner of my eye, I saw Clint's hand tighten on his taser. I pushed the plunger on the syringe, watching the green liquid flow through the IV line. Patient 34B let out a long, satisfied sigh, like someone sinking into a hot bath. That's the good stuff, it murmured. Do you know what you're putting into me, Bobby? Do you know what RT7 really is? I disconnected the syringe, careful not to let my fingers brush against its skin. It's them, patient 34B whispered. Liquefied, processed, the essence of what I need. RT7, room 13, 7 bodies, the last 7 who died trying to contain me. My stomach lurched. It was lying. It had to be lying. The hospital doesn't waste anything, it continued, voice growing slightly slurred as the medication took effect. Especially not the parts that could be useful. We're done here, Clint said firmly, touching my shoulder. Step back, Nurse Roberts. I began to move away from the bed when patient 34B suddenly jerked forward, the restraints creaking under the strain. It didn't break free, but the movement was so unexpected that I flinched and accidentally met its eyes. 1 second. 2. 3. I should look away. I knew I should look away. 4. 5. 6. But those eyes were pulling me in, like black holes consuming everything around them. 7. 8. 9. I can show you, Tommy, it whispered. Just lean a little closer. Bobby! Clint's sharp voice broke the spell. Move back now. I tore my gaze away. realizing with horror that I'd almost hit the 10-second mark. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed toward the door. Patient 34B smiled, a too-wide grin that showed teeth just slightly too pointed to be human. 7 seconds, it said. That's all it took. A piece of me is in you now, Bobby Roberts. A small seed. It will grow. It's lying, Clint said firmly, pulling me toward the exit. That's what it does. We reached the door, and Clint punched in the code. As it slid open, patient 34B called out once more. Ask Dr. Bowman about the sub-basement, Bobby. Ask him what's in room X. Ask him about the others like me. The door closed, cutting off its voice. In the harsh light of the anteroom, I ripped off my goggles and leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. You okay? Clint asked, his own face sheened with sweat. Yeah, I lied. Just wasn't prepared for how personal it gets. Clint nodded grimly. That's its weapon, getting inside your head, making you doubt everything you know. We completed our post-medication protocol in silence, recording the time of administration, the patient's response, and any notable observations. I deliberately omitted the comment about RT7 and Room X. I wasn't sure why. It was clearly manipulation, yet something about the confidence in its voice made me hesitate. You should get some air, Clint suggested as we exited the anteroom. I'll stay here until my relief comes. I nodded gratefully and headed toward the staff lounge, my mind racing. I knew I should dismiss everything patient 34B said as lies designed to unsettle us. That's what Marge and Clint had warned. That's what protocol demanded. But as I walked past the central nursing station, my eyes fell on the hospital directory mounted on the wall. I'd looked at it countless times before, but now I scrutinized it with new intensity. The directory listed all levels. Floors 1 through 4 for regular patients. Sub-levels 1 through 3 for night folk. Nothing about a sub-basement. Nothing about a room X. It was just another lie. It had to be. Then why did Dr. Bowman's face go pale when I rounded the corner and found him standing there, watching me examine the directory? Everything go okay with the medication? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. Fine, I replied, studying his face. Patient was talkative, but nothing we couldn't handle. Something flickered behind his eyes. Relief? Concern? Good, he said. You should get some rest. Your next shift with 34B isn't until morning. As he turned to leave, I found myself calling after him. Dr. Bowman? Is there a sub-basement in this hospital? He froze mid-step, his back to me. For several seconds, he didn't move or speak. When he finally turned around, his face was composed, but his eyes were hard. Who told you about that? He asked quietly. No one, I lied. I've worked here 3 years, and sometimes it feels like there are parts of the hospital I've never seen. Dr. Bowman studied me for a long moment. There are parts of this hospital that no one sees, Nurse Roberts, and it's better that way. For everyone. He walked away, leaving me standing there with a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. 7 seconds. That's all it took. A piece of me is in you now. Sleep eluded me during my break. I tossed and turned on the narrow cot in the staff rest area, my mind replaying the conversation with patient 34B on an endless loop. The things it said about Tommy, about RT7, about a sub-basement, and Dr. Bowman's reaction when I mentioned it. By 7 a.m., my shift was officially over, but I found myself lingering, reluctant to leave while so many questions remained unanswered. I changed into fresh scrubs and headed to the cafeteria, hoping some coffee might clear the fog from my brain. The cafeteria was nearly empty, just a few night shift workers grabbing breakfast before heading home and early morning staff starting their day. I spotted Earl Davis, one of the maintenance workers, sitting alone with a large coffee and a half-eaten breakfast sandwich. Earl had been at Riverside longer than anyone, nearly 40 years. If anyone knew about a sub-basement, it would be him. I grabbed a coffee and made my way to his table. "Mind if I join you?" I asked. Earl looked up, his weathered face breaking into a friendly smile. "Bobby, have a seat, son." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Rough night?" "You could say that." I sat down, wrapping my hands around the warm coffee mug. "New patient in room 13. Earl's smile faltered. His eyes darted around the cafeteria before settling back on me. "Ah," he said quietly. "That explains all the suits running around last night. You know about it?" I kept my voice low. "Been here long enough to see it come and go." Earl took a long sip of his coffee. "Nasty business, that." I leaned forward. "Earl, have you ever heard of a sub-basement? Below sub-level 3? The old maintenance man's face went carefully blank. "What makes you ask about that?" "Just something I overheard." I lied. "Made me curious." Earl pushed his half-eaten sandwich away, his appetite apparently gone. "Some things in this hospital, Bobby, they're better left alone. That's all I'm going to say." "So, there is a sub-basement?" Earl stood up abruptly. "I've got rounds to finish before end of shift. You take care now, Bobby." He left without another word, his breakfast abandoned on the table. I sat there for a moment, unsettled by his reaction. It was confirmation enough. There was something below sub-level 3 that had everyone spooked. As I finished my coffee, I noticed Director Holt enter the cafeteria, speaking intently with Dr. Bowman. They didn't see me, taking a table at the far end of the room. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language screamed tension. Holt leaning forward aggressively, Bowman shaking his head repeatedly. I was about to leave when Marge slid into the seat across from me, startling me. "Don't be obvious," she murmured. "But what did you say to Earl? Man practically ran out of here like his pants were on fire." "I asked him about a sub-basement," I admitted. Marge's eyes widened. "Jesus, Bobby. What got into you?" "Patient 34B mentioned it. Something called Room X. A doctor. Bowman basically confirmed it exists when I asked him." "You asked Bowman?" Marge hissed, keeping her voice low. "Are you trying to get fired, or worse?" "Worse how?" "What's down there, Marge?" I pressed. She glanced over at Holt and Bowman, then back to me. "I don't know exactly. I've never been down there. But I've heard things over the years." She hesitated. "They call it the Vault. It's where they keep the ones they can't control. The ones too dangerous, even for sub-level 3. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "Like Patient 34B? That thing in room 13? It's a puppy compared to what they've got locked in the vault." Marge's normally unflappable demeanor cracked slightly. "Look, Bobby, you're a good nurse and a good man. That's why I'm telling you to drop this. Forget about the sub-basement. Forget whatever that thing told you. Just do your job and go home." "Is that what you do?" I asked. "Just ignore everything strange going on here?" Marge's eyes hardened. "I've been here 15 years. I've seen things that would turn your hair white. And yes, sometimes I ignore them because the alternative is worse." "What alternative?" "Becoming involved," she said grimly. "People who get too curious about this place tend to disappear, Bobby. Or they end up working here permanently, like me." I frowned. "What do you mean, permanently?" Marge checked her watch. "My shift starts in 10 minutes. Just be careful, okay? Stick to the rules. They exist for a reason." She got up to leave, but I caught her arm. "Marge, wait. What did you mean about working here permanently?" She hesitated, then sighed. Did you ever wonder why some of us never seem to leave? Why we work crazy hours, holidays, weekends? Why we don't talk about our lives outside this place? I had wondered, actually. Marge and several others seemed to practically live at the hospital. It's because we don't have lives outside anymore, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Some of us know too much. Some of us have seen too much. And some of us... She glanced down at her marker bracelet. Some of us aren't entirely ourselves anymore. Before I could respond, she walked away, leaving me with a chill that coffee couldn't warm. I should have gone home then. Should have clocked out, driven back to my apartment, and tried to forget everything about patient 34B in the mysterious sub-basement. But something kept me there. Curiosity, stubbornness, or maybe something darker planted in those 7 seconds of eye contact. Instead of leaving, I found myself wandering down to sub-level 3, a floor I rarely visited. It housed our most dangerous patients, elder vampires, berserker werewolves, and creatures so rare they didn't even have proper classifications. Access was restricted, but my badge worked on the elevator. Sub-level 3 looked similar to the other floors, but with enhanced security, reinforced doors, more cameras, and at least 3 armed guards visible from the elevator. I tried to appear casual as I walked past the nurse's station, nodding to Jenny Colton, the charge nurse. "Bobby, what brings you down here?" she asked, surprised. "Doctor?" Bowman asked me to pick up some files. I lied smoothly. Said they'd be at the main desk. Jenny frowned. He didn't mention anything to me about it. "Must have slipped his mind," I said with a shrug. "You know how he gets when things are hectic." Jenny seemed dubious, but didn't challenge me further. "What files are you looking for?" I took a chance. "Something about patient 34B, from their previous stay here." Her face paled slightly. "That information is restricted. You'd need Director Holt's clearance for those files." "Oh, right," I said, feigning embarrassment. "I'll go back and clarify with Dr. Bowman. Sorry to bother you." I turned to leave, but not before glancing around the floor layout. Unlike the other sublevels, this one had a service corridor that extended beyond the patient rooms, a long hallway that ended at a heavy metal door marked "Maintenance Only." I'd walked halfway back to the elevator when the alarm started blaring. Red lights flashed along the corridors, and a calm, automated voice announced, "Code Crimson. All personnel proceed to nearest safe room. This is not a drill. Code Crimson. Code Crimson. Containment breach." My heart began racing as staff members rushed past me toward the designated safe rooms. Jenny was already ushering nurses and orderlies through a reinforced door marked SR3A. "Bobby!" she shouted over the alarm. "Get in here now!" I was about to comply when I noticed something strange, a red light blinking on my marker bracelet. It had never done that before. As I looked around, I saw that everyone else's bracelets were blinking too. "Bobby!" Jenny shouted again. I ran toward the safe room, but just before I reached it, the heavy metal door at the end of the service corridor burst open. 2 security guards came sprinting through, their faces masks of terror. Behind them, something moved in the darkness, something large and formless, like living shadow. "Seal it!" one of the guards screamed. "Seal the door." Jenny pulled me inside the safe room and slammed the heavy door shut just as the guards reached us. I caught a glimpse of the shadowy mass surging forward before the door sealed with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, about 15 staff members huddled in the reinforced room. The guards collapsed against the wall, breathing heavily. "What the hell was that?" I asked. "Vault breach," one of the guards panted. "Something got out." "Was it 34B?" Jenny asked, her face pale. The guard shook his head. "Worse. Much worse. Containment team is on their way, but..." A massive impact shook the door, cutting him off. Everyone fell silent. Another impact followed, stronger than the first. The reinforced door, designed to withstand a rampaging werewolf, actually dented inward. "It shouldn't be able to find us," the second guard whispered. "The safe rooms are shielded." A third impact. The dent grew larger. "Unless it knows where we are," the first guard said, his eyes shifting to me. "Unless someone told it." Before I could protest, my marker bracelet began blinking faster, the red light pulsing in sync with each impact on the door. Around the room, other bracelets remained steady, only mine changing rhythm. "His bracelet," someone hissed. "Look at his bracelet." All eyes turned to me. I held up my wrist, watching in horror as the bracelet blinked rapidly. "I don't understand," I said, panic rising in my throat. "What's happening?" The first guard drew his weapon and pointed it at me. "Take off the bracelet. Slowly." With trembling fingers, I unclasped the marker bracelet and placed it on the floor. It continued to blink, faster now, almost strobing. 7 seconds, I whispered, remembering patient 34B's words. "A piece of me is in you now." Another impact shook the door, the metal groaning under the strain. The guard kept his weapon trained on me. "What did you do, Roberts?" he demanded. "What did you let in?" "Nothing, I swear." "Your bracelet is compromised," Jenny said, backing away from me. "That's not supposed to be possible unless—" She didn't finish the thought, but the implication hung in the air. Unless I wasn't me anymore. Unless whatever was outside had already gotten inside. Inside me. The impacts stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was almost worse than the pounding. My discarded bracelet still blinked on the floor, but slower now, like a heartbeat. Then, the intercom crackled to life. Dr. Bowman's voice filled the room, tense but controlled. "Attention all personnel. Containment has been restored. Remain in safe rooms until security verifies all areas. Anyone with abnormal marker bracelet activity, report to the main security station immediately upon all clear." The guard didn't lower his weapon. "You heard him, Roberts. You're coming with me once we get the all clear." I nodded numbly, staring at my blinking bracelet on the floor, wondering what it meant. What had happened during those 7 seconds of eye contact with patient 34B, and more importantly, what had just escaped from the vault. The security team escorted me to a small, windowless room on sublevel 1 that I'd never seen before. Unlike the clinical spaces of the hospital, this room had concrete walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and 2 uncomfortable-looking chairs. It reminded me of police interrogation rooms from TV shows. They confiscated my badge, my phone, and issued me a new marker bracelet. This one slightly heavier than the standard version, with a small, blinking green light. "Don't remove it," the guard warned. "This one's got a tracker. Try to take it off, and we'll know." I nodded, too exhausted and confused to argue. They left me alone in the room for what felt like hours, though my watch, which they'd allowed me to keep, showed only 45 minutes had passed when the door finally opened. Director Holt entered, followed by Dr. Bowman. Both looked like they hadn't slept in days. Behind them came a man I'd never seen before, tall and gaunt, with silver hair cut military short and small, round spectacles perched on a hawkish nose. He carried an old-fashioned leather doctor's bag. "Nurse Roberts," Director Holt said. Her voice clipped. "This is Dr. Vernon. He specializes in unusual contamination cases." Dr. Vernon offered a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Roberts, I understand you've had direct contact with patient 34B. "Yes," I replied, my mouth dry. "I administered medication early this morning." "And during this interaction, did you maintain protocol, specifically regarding eye contact?" His voice was soft but penetrating, with a slight European accent I couldn't quite place. I hesitated. Lying seemed pointless. They clearly suspected something already. I might have exceeded the 10-second limit, briefly. Dr. Vernon nodded as if I'd confirmed something. He set his bag on the table and removed several items: a small pen light, what looked like a blood pressure cuff with strange modifications, and a device resembling a tuning fork, but made of some dark metal. "How much sleep have you gotten in the past 24 hours, Mr. Roberts?" he asked, pulling on latex gloves. "Maybe 2 hours? 3? And dreams? Any unusual dreams during that time?" I thought back to my fitful nap in the break room. "I dreamed about my brother. He drowned when we were kids." Dr. Vernon exchanged glances with Holt and Bowman. "Patient 34B mentioned your brother during your interaction. Yes?" "Yes." It knew details. Things no one else could know. "That's what it does, Doctor," Bowman interjected. "It finds vulnerabilities and exploits them." Dr. Vernon held up a hand, silencing him. "May I examine you, Mr. Roberts? It's non-invasive, I assure you." I nodded reluctantly. He began with the pen light, shining it into my eyes and observing my pupils. Then he wrapped the modified blood pressure cuff around my arm. Instead of inflating, it emanated a faint humming noise. Finally, he struck the tuning fork against the table and held it near various parts of my body: my head, chest, and wrist, where my old marker bracelet had been. Throughout the examination, he remained silent, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he packed his tools back into the bag with methodical precision. "Well?" Director Holt demanded. "Exposure level 2, possibly early stage 3, Dr. Vernon pronounced. "Definitely contaminated, but the infection hasn't stabilized yet. The marker bracelet absorbed most of it, as designed." My heart sank. Contaminated with what? The three of them exchanged looks, seeming to have a silent conversation about how much to tell me. "Patient 34B is a vector organism," Dr. Vernon finally explained. "It doesn't just communicate telepathically, it transfers pieces of itself. Seeds, you might call them. And I'm infected?" The word tasted bitter in my mouth. "Yes," he said matter-of-factly. "But at a very early stage. Your compromised bracelet contained most of the transfer. Quite fortunate, really." "What would have happened without the bracelet?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know. Dr. Vernon's clinical detachment slipped for just a moment, revealing something like pity. "The entity would have established a deeper connection. Eventually, it would have been able to access your thoughts, influence your actions, even replace you, while maintaining your outward appearance." A cold shiver ran down my spine as I remembered Marge's words. Some of us aren't entirely ourselves anymore. "How do we fix it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll prescribe a regimen of specialized medication," Dr. Vernon said, opening his bag again. "And you'll need to wear this enhanced marker bracelet for at least 2 weeks. It will monitor the contamination levels and help neutralize any remaining seeds." He removed a small amber bottle from his bag and set it on the table. 2 tablets every 6 hours. They may cause headaches, nausea, vivid dreams, all normal side effects. "And the breach?" I asked, looking at Dr. Bowman. "What got out of the vault?" The room went silent. Dr. Vernon stopped writing on his prescription pad, and Director Holt's already severe expression hardened further. "That information is classified," she said coldly. "With all due respect, Director," I countered, surprising myself with my boldness. "Something nearly broke down a reinforced safe room door, and my bracelet was somehow linked to it. I think I deserve some answers." Dr. Bowman sighed, rubbing his forehead. He's right, Victoria. He's involved now, whether we like it or not. Director Holt glared at him, then at me, before giving a curt nod. The bare minimum, then. Dr. Bowman turned to me. The sub-basement, what we call the vault, houses entities that are too dangerous or too valuable to be kept in regular containment. Patient 34B was originally housed there until we developed better containment methods for its specific abilities. And what escaped? I pressed. We call it the Hollow, Dr. Bowman said quietly. It's related to patient 34B in a way. They were found together, but the Hollow is much more aggressive. It doesn't try to replace or manipulate. It consumes, absorbs. It's been contained in the vault for nearly 40 years. How did it get out? Director Holt's jaw tightened. That's what we're investigating. The timing, coinciding with 34B's return, is unlikely to be coincidence. Your compromised bracelet was responding to the Hollow, Dr. Vernon added. The seeds from 34B have a sympathetic connection to other entities of its kind, like calling to like. I tried to process this information, my exhausted brain struggling to keep up. So this thing, the Hollow, is loose in the hospital? No, Director Holt said firmly. We've recaptured it. The containment team managed to drive it back to the vault and secure it. But the breach is concerning. Very concerning. Dr. Vernon closed his bag with a snap. I've prescribed the medication and recommended continued monitoring. Will there be anything else, Director? No, thank you, Doctor. Please submit your full report by end of day. Dr. Vernon nodded and left without another word to me, as if I'd become just another case file to be documented and filed away. When the door closed behind him, I looked between Holt and Bowman. What now? Am I fired? Quarantined? Neither for the moment, Director Holt replied. You'll continue your duties, but you're restricted from Sub-Level 3 and any contact with Patient 34B. And you will check in with Medical Daily for evaluation, Dr. Bowman added. The medication should clear the contamination within 2 weeks, assuming you follow the regimen precisely. I nodded, relief washing over me. I still had my job. I wasn't being locked away in some dark corner of the hospital. But one question still nagged at me. Why did patient 34B target me specifically? There must be dozens of staff it could have tried to contaminate. Director Holt and Dr. Bowman exchanged another one of those meaningful glances. We don't know, Doctor, Bowman admitted. But these entities don't do anything randomly. It chose you for a reason. Perhaps because you were new to it, Director Holt suggested. Most of the staff who interact with 34B have done so before. They're more guarded. Somehow, I didn't think that was the whole truth, but I was too tired to push further. Can I go now? I really need some sleep. One more thing, Director Holt said, sliding a document across the table. This is a non-disclosure agreement. It covers everything we've discussed today, plus any other classified information you may have encountered or may encounter in the future regarding the vault, Patient 34B, or the Hollow. I scanned the multi-page document. The legal language was dense, but the penalties for violation were clear enough. Termination, possible criminal charges, and something ominously referred to as memory adjustment protocol. Memory adjustment, I questioned. Standard language, Dr. Bowman said dismissively. Just hospital legal covering all bases. I signed the document, too exhausted to argue or ask more questions. At this point, I just wanted to go home, take the weird pills, and sleep for about 20 hours. Report to Dr. Kane in medical at the start of your next shift, Director Holt instructed, taking the signed form. He'll assess your condition and clear you for duty if appropriate. I nodded and stood to leave. And Roberts? She added, her voice softening slightly. Be careful. Watch for unusual thoughts, impulses, or dreams. Report them immediately, no matter how insignificant they seem." "Yes, ma'am." As I reached the door, Dr. Bowman called after me. "Bobby, about your brother. Patient 34B uses personal tragedies to manipulate. Whatever it told you about Tommy, don't let it get to you." I appreciated the sentiment, but it was too late for that. The seed had already been planted, in more ways than one. I drove home in a daze, the amber bottle of pills rattling in my pocket. My apartment felt strangely unfamiliar, as if I'd been gone for weeks instead of a day. My cat, Merlin, greeted me with his usual indifferent meow before demanding breakfast. The normality of feeding my cat and changing into pajamas felt surreal after everything that had happened. I swallowed 2 of the prescribed pills with a glass of water. They tasted bitter, with an aftertaste like burned metal. As I crawled into bed, pulling the blackout curtains closed against the morning sun, I couldn't stop thinking about everything I'd learned. The vault, the hollow, patient 34B, and its strange connection to me. Most disturbing was the realization that some of the hospital staff might already be compromised. Marge had practically admitted as much. How many others? And how would I know who to trust? Sleep came quickly, dragging me under like a riptide, and with it came the dreams. I stood at the edge of a lake. The same lake where Tommy had drowned 20 years ago. The water was black and still, reflecting nothing, not even the moonlight that illuminated everything else. "Bobby." The voice came from behind me. I turned to see Tommy standing there, just as I remembered him, 12 years old, with freckles across his nose and our mother's hazel eyes. But something was wrong. His skin was too pale, almost translucent. Water dripped continuously from his clothes and hair, though he'd been standing there for some time. "You're not real," I said. "You're not Tommy." The boy smiled, and there was something wrong with his teeth. Too many. Too sharp. "Part of me is," he replied, his voice echoing strangely. "The part that remembers you, big brother. The part that called for you that day." "Tommy died," I said firmly. "I couldn't save him." "Couldn't?" The thing wearing my brother's face tilted its head. "Or wouldn't. You were on the shore. You saw him struggling. You froze." "I was 10 years old," I protested, but the old guilt twisted in my chest. "I couldn't swim well enough." "You didn't even try." His expression hardened. "But I'm giving you another chance." He pointed to the dark water of the lake. "I'm still down there, Bobby. Still waiting. Come find me." I took an involuntary step toward the water. "That's it," the boy encouraged. "Just a little further." Another step. The water lapped at my feet, impossibly cold. "You want to save me, don't you, Bobby?" His voice had changed, taking on echoes and undertones that weren't human. "You want to make it right?" I was knee-deep in the freezing water now, my limbs growing numb. "Just a little deeper," the thing that wasn't Tommy urged. "I'm so close. I'm right here." The water reached my waist, then my chest. Each step took me deeper into the blackness. I couldn't feel my legs anymore. Couldn't really feel anything except the pull to go deeper, to find Tommy, to make things right. As the water reached my chin, I saw movement beneath the surface. Pale shapes shifting in the depths. Faces pressed against some invisible barrier. Mouths open in silent screams. Dozens of them. Hundreds. And I recognized some of them. Hospital staff who had disappeared over the years. Patients who had died under mysterious circumstances. They were all down there, waiting. And I was about to join them. "Almost there," the false Tommy crooned from the shore, his voice now a chorus of overlapping whispers. "Just one more step, Bobby. One more step and you can save everyone. I took that step, and the black water closed over my head. I woke up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat. My heart pounded painfully in my chest, and the metallic taste of the medication filled my mouth. The dream had been so vivid, so real. I fumbled for the lamp beside my bed, desperate to banish the darkness. As light flooded the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My feet were wet, dripping lake water onto the hardwood floor. And beside them, tracked across the room from the door to my bed, were muddy footprints that weren't mine. I called in sick the next day. The official reason was a fever, not entirely a lie, as I'd woken up shivering despite the summer heat. The real reason was the muddy footprints leading to my bed and the lake water soaking my sheets. I spent an hour searching my apartment for any sign of an intruder, but the doors and windows were all locked from the inside. The footprints didn't match any of my shoes, and they simply stopped at my bedside, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them, had vanished into thin air. By noon, I'd taken another dose of Dr. Vernon's medication and was slumped on my couch, feeling simultaneously wired and exhausted. The TV was on, playing some mindless daytime talk show that I wasn't really watching. Merlin was curled up beside me, unusually clingy, as if sensing something was wrong. My phone rang. Dr. Bowman. "Roberts," he said when I answered, skipping any greeting. "Doctor, Kane says you called in sick." "Yeah, I'm not feeling great," I replied. "Probably side effects from the medication." There was a pause. "What kind of side effects?" I hesitated. Should I tell him about the footprints? The dream that felt too real? Something held me back. Fever, nausea, weird dreams. Dr. Vernon said that was normal. "It is," Bowman confirmed. "But I'd like you to come in anyway. We need to monitor your condition more closely than I initially thought." "I can come in tomorrow," I offered. "I should be feeling better by then." "Today, Roberts." His tone left no room for argument. "As soon as possible." I sighed, rubbing my temples where a headache was forming. "Is something wrong?" Another pause. "We've had some developments with patient 34B. It's been asking for you specifically." That sent a chill down my spine. What did it say? Nothing specific. It just keeps repeating your name and saying you have something it needs. Bowman's voice tightened. "Look, I know you feel like hell right now. The medication is rough, but I need you to come in so we can run some additional tests. Make sure the contamination isn't progressing." The idea of going back to the hospital filled me with dread. But Bowman was right. If something was wrong with me, if the seeds patient 34B had planted were growing despite the medication, I needed to know. "I'll be there in an hour," I relented. "Good. Come directly to medical on sublevel 1. Use the service elevator by the loading dock. Less people that way." The call ended, and I sat there for a moment, scratching Merlin behind the ears. "What do you think, buddy? Am I losing my mind, or am I actually contaminated by some ancient entity?" Merlin blinked slowly at me, purring. "Yeah, that's what I thought too." The hospital seemed different somehow when I arrived. Quieter, tenser. The few staff members I passed in the service corridors averted their eyes or gave me a wide berth. Word had clearly spread about my contamination. The medical unit on sublevel 1 was a small but well-equipped facility, separate from the main patient care areas. It primarily served staff who were injured on duty or exposed to potential contaminants from nightfolk patients. Dr. Kane was waiting for me, a short, sturdy man with salt and pepper hair and the perpetually tired expression of someone who'd seen too much. He wore standard scrubs beneath his white coat, but the enhanced marker bracelet on his wrist matched my own. "Bobby," he greeted me with a nod. How are the meds treating you? Like I drank drain cleaner and chased it with battery acid, I replied. He chuckled dryly. Sounds about right. The metallic taste is the worst part. It fades after a few days. He led me to an exam room and went through the standard checks: vitals, pupil response, reflexes. Then he drew several vials of blood and had me provide a urine sample. Any unusual experiences since starting the medication? He asked as he labeled the samples. Blackouts? Lost time? Hearing voices? Just weird dreams, I said, deciding to keep the footprints to myself for now. Really vivid ones about my brother who died when we were kids. Dr. Kane nodded thoughtfully. That tracks. The entities like 34B often work through emotional trauma. Easier access point. He made some notes in my chart. The medication should help suppress those dreams. If they continue or intensify, let me know immediately. I wanted to ask him more questions, but Dr. Bowman entered before I could. His face was grave. The tests? He asked Dr. Kane. Running now. Initial readings are within expected parameters. Kane glanced between us. I'll go check on those samples. He left, closing the door behind him. Dr. Bowman took the vacated seat, looking tired. You look like hell, I observed. Been a long 24 hours, he replied. Between 34B's increased activity and dealing with the aftermath of the Hollow's breach, I haven't slept much. What did patient 34B want with me? I asked. You said it's been asking for me. Bowman reached into his lab coat and removed a small digital recorder. It might be easier if you just listen. He pressed play, and patient 34B's unnervingly pleasant voice filled the room. Where's Bobby? I need to speak with Bobby Roberts. He has something of mine, you see. Something precious. He thinks your little pills will purge me, but I'm already rooted too deep. The lake remembers, Doctor. The lake remembers what he did. Dr. Bowman stopped the recording, watching my reaction closely. What lake? He asked. What is it talking about? I swallowed hard. My brother drowned in Hawkins Lake when I was 10. He was out too far, and I couldn't save him. And you dreamed about this lake recently? I nodded. Last night, after taking the medication. Bowman's expression darkened. That's not good. The medication should be suppressing the connection, not enhancing it. What does it mean? I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. Before he could answer, the exam room door burst open. Dr. Kane stood there, face pale. We have a problem, he said tersely. Robert's blood work. The contamination markers are off the charts. Dr. Bowman stood abruptly. That's not possible. The medication isn't working, Kane finished. At least not on him. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and clinical interest. Either he's got a natural immunity to the treatment, or the connection is stronger than we thought, Bowman concluded grimly. The two doctors stared at me as if I'd suddenly grown a second head. I shifted uncomfortably under their scrutiny. So, what happens now? I asked. Stronger medication? Different treatment? Quarantine, Bowman said flatly. Isolation until we can develop an alternative approach. For how long? As long as necessary. The walls of the small exam room seemed to close in around me. I felt trapped, cornered. A wave of claustrophobia washed over me, along with something else. Something angry and desperate that didn't quite feel like my own emotion. No, I said, the word coming out before I'd even decided to speak. I'm not being locked away because your treatment isn't working. Dr. Bowman's expression hardened. This isn't a request, Roberts. It's protocol. Screw protocol, I snapped, surging to my feet. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be contaminated by some thing that's playing mind games with me. My vision blurred momentarily, and I noticed with a distant sort of horror that the lights in the room were flickering. The metal instruments on the nearby tray began to rattle. "Bobby," Dr. Kane said cautiously, "I need you to calm down. Your marker readings are spiking." I looked down at my wrist. The green light on my enhanced bracelet was now flashing red, the same as before during the Hollow's breach. Fear cut through my anger like a cold knife. This wasn't me. This wasn't how I reacted to stress. Something else was pushing its way to the surface. "I'm sorry," I gasped, forcing myself to take deep breaths. I don't know what came over me. The light stabilized, and the rattling stopped. My bracelet's light slowly transitioned back to an amber color. Caution, not emergency. Dr. Bowman and Dr. Kane exchanged worried glances. "Isolation is for your own safety as much as ours," Bowman said, his voice gentler now. "We need to figure out why the medication isn't working for you." I nodded, the fight gone out of me. "Okay, just tell me what's happening to me. Please." Dr. Kane stepped forward. "The entities like 34B in the Hollow, they're not just telepathic. They're symbiotic. They form connections with hosts. Usually, the marker bracelets prevent those connections from taking hold, and the medication eliminates any contamination that does occur." "But not for me," I said. "No," he agreed. "For some reason you're compatible with it. More compatible than most." Dr. Bowman's pager beeped. He checked it and swore under his breath. "Patient 34B is becoming agitated. We need to move Roberts to isolation now before—" An alarm cut him off, the same blaring sound I'd heard during the Hollow's breach. "Code Crimson." "That's not possible, Doctor," Kane whispered. "The containment on room 13 was reinforced after you brought it in. It shouldn't be able to." The lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness for several heart-stopping seconds before the emergency generators kicked in, bathing everything in dim red light. "Move," Dr. Bowman barked, grabbing my arm. "We need to get to a safe room." We hurried into the corridor, joining the flow of panicked staff members rushing toward the nearest safe room. The alarm continued to blare, punctuated by the automated announcement, "Code Crimson. All personnel proceed to nearest safe room. This is not a drill." As we ran, I felt a strange pulling sensation, as if invisible threads were tugging at me from multiple directions. My marker bracelet flashed between amber and red, the pattern irregular and frantic. "What's happening to me?" I gasped, stumbling slightly. "It's calling to you," Dr. Bowman said grimly, keeping a firm grip on my arm. "Both of them are." "Both?" 34B and the Hollow. They're both loose now, and they both want you." We rounded a corner and nearly collided with Marge, who was ushering frightened staff towards safe room 1B. "Bowman!" she shouted over the alarm. "They're saying both containments failed simultaneously. How is that possible?" "I don't know," he replied. "Get these people secured. We need to get Roberts to special containment." Marge's eyes widened when she saw me, taking in my flashing bracelet. "Christ, Bobby. What did you do?" "Nothing," I protested. "I just—" The words died in my throat as a familiar voice echoed down the corridor behind us. "Bobby," it called, calm and friendly amid the chaos. "There you are. I've been looking for you." We turned to see patient 34B standing at the far end of the corridor. It still wore the same unremarkable human form, but now it moved with fluid grace, completely unrestrained. Behind it, shadows writhed and twisted. The Hollow, I realized with mounting horror. "Run!" Dr. Bowman shouted, shoving me toward Marge. "Get him to special containment. I'll hold them off." How? I demanded. What are you going to do? Dr. Bowman reached into his coat and pulled out a small metal cylinder. Something I've been saving for a worst-case scenario. Now go. Marge grabbed my arm and pulled me away. The last I saw of Dr. Bowman, he was standing alone in the corridor, facing patient 34B and the roiling darkness behind it. What is special containment? I gasped as Marge led me through a series of corridors I'd never seen before. Where we put staff who've been compromised, she replied grimly. It's the only place that might hold you now. Hold me? I'm not. You are. She cut me off. Look at your bracelet, Bobby. Look at what's happening to it. I glanced down. The marker bracelet wasn't just flashing now. It was changing color entirely, shifting from Riverside's standard blue to a deep, unnatural purple. What does that mean? I asked, though part of me already knew. Marge's expression was a mixture of pity and determination. It means you're becoming a beacon, a doorway, and if we don't contain you, whatever comes through that door is going to be a hell of a lot worse than what's already loose. Special containment turned out to be on sub-level 2, behind a heavy steel door marked simply, Authorized Personnel Only. Marge pressed her badge against the scanner, entered a 6-digit code, then placed her hand on a biometric reader. Security override Wilkins 7 Delta 3, she said clearly. Emergency protocol enabled. The door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a stark white corridor, unlike the rest of the hospital. No medical equipment lined these walls, just a series of numbered doors with small observation windows and complex electronic locks. What is this place? I asked as she pulled me inside. Where we keep our own, Marge replied grimly. Staff who've been compromised beyond treatment. The alarm was muffled here, but still audible, a distant wail punctuated by the automated announcements. Red emergency lights cast everything in a bloody glow. How many? I began, then rephrased. Are there others here right now? Marge led me past the first few doors without answering. I glanced through the observation windows as we passed. Most rooms were empty, containing only a bed, a sink, and a toilet. But the third room... I nearly stopped in my tracks. A man sat cross-legged on the floor, rocking slightly. His back was to the door, but something about his posture seemed familiar. Is that Dr. Harrison? I asked, remembering the name patient 34B had mentioned. Marge tugged me along. Don't look. Don't engage. Some of them can influence you even through the containment fields. But that's Dr. Harrison, isn't it? The one patient 34B talked about? Former chief of medicine, Marge confirmed reluctantly. From before my time. They found him during the first containment breach 30 years ago. What was left of him, anyway? He's been in there for 30 years? The thought made me sick. He's safer in there. For him and everyone else. Her voice was flat, matter of fact, but I caught the undercurrent of old pain. Most staff who get compromised don't last more than a few months before the entity burns them out completely. Harrison is... unique. We passed more rooms. Most were empty, but a few contained occupants, hospital staff in various states. Some seemed normal, sitting on beds reading or watching small television screens. Others were clearly not themselves anymore, prowling their small spaces like caged animals or standing unnaturally still in corners. Here, Marge said, stopping at a room marked S17. She swiped her badge again and entered another code. This one's been prepped for you. The door slid open, revealing a small but clean room similar to the others. Bed, sink, toilet. A shelf held a few books and magazines. A small television was mounted in one corner, behind a protective shield. "How long?" I asked, not moving to enter. "Until we figure out what's happening with you," she replied. "Why the medication isn't working. Why both entities are targeting you specifically. And if you can't figure it out, what then? I stay here forever like Harrison?" Marge's expression softened slightly. "Bobby, I've known you for 3 years. You're a good nurse and a better person. I don't want to see you end up like some of the others. But right now, you're a danger to yourself and everyone else in this hospital." I knew she was right. Whatever was happening to me was beyond my control, beyond my understanding. The memory of the rattling instruments, the flickering lights, my own sudden rage, all signs that something was working through me. I stepped into the room, trying to ignore the way my heart hammered against my ribs, trying to ignore the feeling that I was walking into my own tomb. "The room is specially shielded," Marge explained, not following me in. "It should dampen whatever connection is forming between you and the entities." "Should?" She gave me a tight smile. "We've never had someone simultaneously targeted by both 34B and the Hollow before. You're breaking new ground, Bobby." "Lucky me," I muttered. Marge's hand hovered over the door control. "Dr. Kane will check on you soon. Try to rest if you can." Before I could respond, the lights flickered again, more violently this time. The alarm, which had been steadily wailing, suddenly cut off, leaving an eerie silence. The door control panel beside Marge began to spark. "That's not good," she said, backing away from the malfunctioning panel. "What's happening?" I asked, a fresh wave of panic rising. "System failure. The containment breach must have damaged the main security grid." She looked down the corridor, her face tense. "I need to check on the other containment cells. Make sure they're still secure." "Wait," I called as she turned to leave. "What about me? What if the door locks?" "It won't," she assured me. "System failures default to manual override. You'll be able to open it from inside if necessary, but, Bobby..." Her expression hardened. "Don't leave this room unless your life is in immediate danger. Understand?" I nodded, and she hurried away, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Alone in the small room, I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to control my racing thoughts. The silence was unnerving after the constant blare of the alarm. I could hear my own heartbeat, my own breathing, and something else. A faint whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Bobby." It sighed, the sound barely perceptible. "Bobby, Bobby, Bobby." I shot to my feet, spinning around. "Who's there?" No answer, just the same whispered repetition of my name, like a mantra or a prayer. The marker bracelet on my wrist pulsed with that strange purple light, growing warmer against my skin. I tried to pry it off, but it was sealed tight, the clasp refusing to budge. "Damn it," I hissed, giving up the effort. My head was beginning to pound, a dull throbbing behind my eyes that grew stronger with each pulse of the bracelet. The whispers intensified, becoming a chorus of overlapping voices, some familiar, some strange. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were coming from inside my head. "Stop," I groaned, sinking back onto the bed. "Please stop." The television in the corner suddenly switched on, flickering with static. Through the snow of interference, a face began to form. Not a broadcast, but something pushing through from somewhere else. The face solidified, and my blood ran cold. Tommy stared at me from the screen, just as he had in my dream, 12 years old forever, water streaming from his hair and clothes. "You left me there," he said, his voice distorted by the static. "You watched me drown. You're not real. I said through gritted teeth. "You're not Tommy." "Part of me is," the thing on the screen replied, using the same words from my dream. "The part that remembers you, big brother." The image flickered, changing briefly to patient 34B's bland human face before returning to Tommy's. The transition was so quick, I almost missed it. "What do you want from me?" I demanded. "To finish what we started," Not Tommy said. "At the lake. You need to go back there, Bobby. Back to where it all began." "I'm not going anywhere," I declared, though my conviction was wavering under the relentless pounding in my skull. The television image distorted again, this time resolving into Dr. Bowman's face. Blood streaked from a gash on his forehead, and his eyes were wide with panic. "Roberts!" he gasped. "If you can hear this, the entity has compromised the hospital systems. It's using the intercom, the security cameras, everything connected to the main grid." "Dr. Bowman? What happened? Are you okay?" "Don't trust what you see," he continued urgently. "Don't trust what you hear. Both entities are working together now, using the hospital's own systems against us. They're trying to..." His image flickered, replaced momentarily by static, before Tommy's face reappeared, smiling now. "Poor Dr. Bowman," he said, shaking his head. "He tried so hard to stop us, but he never understood what we really are." The image changed again, showing a corridor where staff members ran in panic as darkness flowed along the ceiling and walls like living ink. I recognized the location, the main corridor on sub-level 1, not far from the safe rooms. "You see what's happening?" Tommy's voice asked over the footage. "They can't stop it. Not without you." The scene shifted again, showing Marge frantically trying to secure one of the doors in special containment. The lock mechanism sparked and failed, and the door slowly opened to reveal a figure standing in the darkness within. Dr. Harrison, his back still turned. "Marge!" I shouted uselessly. "Behind you!" On screen, Marge sensed the presence and turned. Her face contorted in fear as Dr. Harrison's head rotated 180 degrees to face her, his neck twisting impossibly. His features were blurred, as if constantly shifting beneath the skin. The screen went black. The silence in my small room felt oppressive, weighted with dread. "She'll die," Tommy's voice said from the darkened screen. "They'll all die. Unless you help us." My bracelet burned against my skin now, the purple light pulsing in sync with the throbbing in my head. I could feel something building inside me, a pressure that threatened to split me open from within. "What do you want me to do?" I whispered, desperation overriding caution. The television flickered back to life, showing a map of the hospital. A route illuminated in red, leading from special containment, through the service corridors, to the main elevator. "Come to us," Tommy's voice urged. "Come to room 13. We'll explain everything there." Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, that I was being manipulated. But what choice did I have? Marge was in danger. Dr. Bowman was injured, or worse. The entire hospital was under attack. And somehow, I was the key to all of it. I approached the door, hesitating with my hand over the manual release. Marge had told me not to leave unless my life was in immediate danger. But what about everyone else's lives? With a deep breath, I pulled the emergency release. The door slid open, revealing the empty corridor beyond. The red emergency lights cast everything in crimson shadows, making the white walls look like they were bleeding. As I stepped out of the room, my bracelet's purple glow intensified, casting an eerie light ahead of me. The whispers in my head grew louder, more insistent. "This way," they urged. "Hurry." I followed the route that had been shown on the television, moving as quietly as possible. The hospital seemed deserted now, everyone either evacuated or hidden in safe rooms. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the distant muffled crashes and bangs of the ongoing chaos. At one junction, I paused, hearing voices ahead. I pressed myself against the wall, peering cautiously around the corner. 2 security guards stood blocking the corridor, weapons drawn. They were arguing, their voices tense. "We need to get to the upper levels," one insisted. "This whole place is coming apart." "Orders are to maintain position," the other replied. "No one gets through, especially not staff showing contamination." I glanced down at my glowing bracelet. There was no way I could get past them unnoticed. I was about to retreat and find another route when a strange calm descended over me. "Let me handle this," a voice whispered in my mind. Not Tommy's voice this time, but one eerily similar to my own. Before I could resist, I felt my body moving forward of its own accord. I stepped into view, facing the guards. "Halt!" one shouted, raising his weapon. "Stay where you are." My lips moved, but the voice that came out wasn't entirely mine. "You don't see anything concerning," it said smoothly. "I'm authorized personnel responding to the emergency." The guards' expressions went blank. Their weapons lowered slowly. "Authorized personnel," one repeated dully, "responding to the emergency." "You'll let me pass," my voice continued. "Then you'll forget you saw me." They stepped aside in unison, their movements mechanical. I walked between them, a chill running down my spine at how easily they'd been influenced. Once past them, I felt control return to me. I wanted to run, to find someone who could help me fight whatever was happening, but the pressure in my head increased painfully every time I tried to deviate from the path to room 13. "Almost there," the whispers encouraged. "Almost home." The elevator at the end of the corridor was operational despite the emergency. As I approached, the doors slid open on their own, inviting me in. "Don't do this," a small, rational part of my mind pleaded. "Don't go to them." But my feet carried me forward anyway, into the elevator. The doors closed behind me, and I felt the car begin to descend, taking me down to room 13, taking me to patient 34B and the hollow, taking me home. The elevator doors opened to a scene of devastation. The normally sterile corridor of sublevel 2 was in ruins. Ceiling panels torn down, medical equipment scattered across the floor, and dark, viscous fluid splattered across the walls. The emergency lights flickered intermittently, plunging sections of the hallway into darkness every few seconds. I stepped out cautiously, my enhanced bracelet casting its purple glow ahead of me. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing down the empty corridor. "Is anyone here?" No response, just the distant sound of metal groaning and occasional electrical sparks from damaged equipment. According to the map I'd seen on the television, room 13 was at the far end of the west wing. I began making my way in that direction, careful to avoid the debris littering the floor. Each step closer to my destination made the pressure in my head build, as if something were pushing against the inside of my skull, demanding release. As I rounded a corner, I came across the first body, a security guard lying face down in a pool of blood. I knelt beside him, checking for a pulse out of professional habit, though I knew from the unnatural angle of his neck that he was beyond help. More bodies appeared as I continued. Nurses, doctors, orderlies. Some showed signs of violent struggle, while others looked as if they'd simply collapsed where they stood. I recognized faces among the dead, colleagues I'd worked with for years, now still and silent on the cold floor. The guilt was overwhelming. Whatever was happening, I was part of it somehow. The entities had targeted me specifically, used me as some kind of conduit or catalyst. "Not your fault," whispered a voice that sounded like Tommy but wasn't. "They would have died anyway. Everyone dies eventually." "Shut up," I hissed through gritted teeth. Get out of my head. A chuckle echoed in my mind. Too late for that, Bobby. We're already in too deep. I reached a junction where the corridor split in two directions. The left path was dark. The emergency lights completely failed. The right was illuminated, leading toward the main werewolf ward, away from room 13. Without conscious decision, my body turned left, drawn toward the darkness. My bracelet's purple glow provided the only light, creating grotesque shadows that seemed to move at the edges of my vision. Something skittered across the floor ahead of me, something low to the ground and unnaturally fast. I froze, straining to see in the dim purple light. "Who's there?" I called. A figure emerged from the shadows, and for a moment, I thought it was a patient. Maybe one of the werewolves who'd escaped their room during the chaos. But as it stepped into the light cast by my bracelet, I realized it wasn't a werewolf or any other night folk I recognized. It had once been human. That much was clear from the tattered remains of a lab coat it still wore. But the body was wrong, limbs too long and jointed in impossible places, head cocked at an angle that should have been fatal. Its face was half-formed, features shifting and flowing like wax under heat. Jimmy?" The thing rasped, using a colleague's voice. Jimmy Chen, one of our lab technicians. "Is that you? Help me. Something's wrong with me." I backed away slowly. This wasn't Jimmy. It couldn't be. The real Jimmy would have been in one of the safe rooms during the containment breach. "Stay back," I warned, looking around for anything I could use as a weapon. The Jimmy thing tilted its misshapen head, features still flowing. "Bobby? Bobby Roberts?" Recognition seemed to dawn in its distorted eyes. "You're the one they want." It lurched forward suddenly, movements jerky and uncoordinated. I turned to run, but my foot caught on a piece of debris, sending me sprawling to the floor. My head struck something hard, and stars exploded across my vision. The creature was on me in an instant, its two long fingers wrapping around my throat. Up close, I could see that its skin was translucent in places, revealing not blood and muscle beneath, but something dark and writhing. "They're waiting," it gurgled, its jaw distending as it spoke. "In the dark, in the deep." My lungs burned as I struggled for air. The pressure in my head was excruciating now, building to a point I thought my skull might crack. Just as my vision began to tunnel, something strange happened. The purple light from my bracelet pulsed once, twice, then flared blindingly bright. The Jimmy thing shrieked and recoiled, its hands smoking where they'd touched me. It scrambled backward, cowering against the wall. "Protected," it hissed, its voice now a chorus of overlapping tones. "Marked, claimed." I gasped for air, rubbing my bruised throat as I struggled to my feet. The creature continued to press itself against the wall, as far from me as possible, its eyes fixed on my glowing bracelet. "What am I?" I demanded, my voice hoarse. "What did they do to me?" The creature's features rippled, momentarily forming a face I recognized. Not Jimmy's, but Dr. Vernon's. "Not what they did," it said, the voice a perfect imitation of the specialist's clinical tone. "What you've always been, a doorway, a key." It melted back into its distorted form, then scuttled away into the darkness, leaving me alone with those cryptic words. I continued down the darkened corridor, my mind racing. A doorway, a key. The entities had called me those things as well. But what did it mean? What had I always been? The corridor ended at a set of double doors, marked with a biohazard symbol. This wasn't the route to room 13 that I'd been shown, but something pulled me forward anyway. My bracelet's glow intensified as I approached, the light shifting from purple to a deep, pulsing crimson. I pushed through the doors into what had once been a laboratory. Like the corridor, it was in ruins, Equipment smashed, tables overturned, and the same dark fluid dripping from the ceiling. In the center of the room, something had been drawn on the floor, a complex pattern of interlocking circles and symbols that glowed with the same crimson light as my bracelet. Standing at the edge of the pattern was a familiar figure, Dr. Bowman. His back was to me, but I recognized his stoop-shouldered silhouette. Blood stained his white coat, and he seemed to be swaying slightly, as if struggling to remain standing. "Dr. Bowman?" I called cautiously. He turned slowly. His face was pale, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, just as I'd seen in the television vision. But his eyes were solid black, like polished obsidian. Patient 34B's eyes. "Bobby," he said, his voice a disturbing blend of Bowman's and 34B's. "You came. Good boy." I took a step backward. "You're not Doctor Bowman." "Parts of me are," it replied with a terrible smile. "Just like parts of your brother are in me, just like parts of you will be, soon enough." From the shadows behind Not Bowman, something massive stirred, a shapeless darkness that seemed to absorb what little light there was. The hollow. It moved with liquid grace, flowing across the floor toward the glowing pattern. "What is this?" I asked, gesturing to the pattern. "What are you doing?" "Finishing what was started long ago," Not Bowman replied. "Creating a permanent doorway between worlds, your world and ours. And you need me for that?" "Why?" "Because you're the last piece." Not Bowman pointed to a blank space in the center of the pattern. "The final component. The one we've been waiting for." "I won't help you," I said firmly, though my feet seemed rooted to the spot, unable to retreat further. Not Bowman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You already have. Every rule you followed, every protocol you maintained, all of it leading to this moment." He spread his arms wide. "Why do you think the hospital has those rules in the first place? To protect you?" "No, to prepare you." My mind reeled. "Prepare me for what?" "Convergence," a new voice announced from behind me. I spun to see Director Holt standing in the doorway, flanked by two figures in what looked like hazmat suits, but made of some strange, metallic fabric. She herself wore a form-fitting suit of similar material, her silver-streaked hair pulled back severely. "Director," I gasped. "Thank God. These things, they've taken over Dr. Bowman. They're trying to—" "I know exactly what they're trying to do, Nurse Roberts." She cut me off, her voice cold. "They're trying to complete the ritual we've spent 50 years preparing, and you're going to help them do it." I stared at her, uncomprehending. "What? No. These things have killed people. They've destroyed the hospital." "Necessary sacrifices," Holt replied dismissively. "Do you think we built this facility just to treat night folk? That was merely a convenient cover. The true purpose has always been this moment. This convergence." The two figures beside her moved forward, reaching for me with gloved hands. I tried to back away, but Not Bowman was behind me, and the hollow had completely surrounded the glowing pattern, cutting off escape. "I don't understand," I pleaded. "Why me?" "What convergence?" "You had the right bloodline," Holt explained matter-of-factly. "The right genetic markers. We've been watching you since you were a child, Bobby. Since the day your brother drowned in that lake." The pressure in my head spiked at the mention of Tommy. Flashes of memory surfaced, not just of the drowning, but of afterward. Men and women in suits asking questions. Medical tests that my mother had insisted were routine. Foster homes after she disappeared, each one stranger than the last. "You've been manipulating my entire life," I realized with growing horror. "All of this, my job here, patient 34B, all of it, was planned. Not all of it. Not Bowman said from behind me. Some things even they couldn't control, like how strongly you would respond to our call, how perfectly you would serve as a vessel. The suited figures grabbed my arms, their grips like iron despite my struggles. They began dragging me toward the center of the pattern, toward the hollow that waited like a pool of living darkness. "Don't fight it, Bobby," Holt urged. "Embrace your purpose. You're going to be part of something magnificent. The first true bridge between worlds." As they pulled me forward, my enhanced bracelet's crimson glow intensified until it was painfully bright. The symbols in the pattern responded, pulsing in sync with it. The hollow seemed to rear up, forming a towering wave of darkness that loomed over us all. Not Bowman stepped into the pattern, his form beginning to distort and shift, black eyes fixed on mine. "We're going to be together, Bobby. Just like you and Tommy were supposed to be. Forever." I struggled against my captors with renewed desperation, but their grip was unyielding. They dragged me to the center of the pattern and forced me to my knees. The hollow began to flow over my legs, an icy coldness that burned like frostbite wherever it touched. "Please," I gasped, looking up at Holt. "Don't do this." Her expression remained impassive. "The convergence must happen, Bobby. It's been written since before any of us were born." The hollow continued to envelop me, rising to my waist now. Not Bowman approached, extending a hand that was no longer entirely human, fingers elongating into talons. "Time to come home, little brother," he said in Tommy's voice. "Time to drown with me." As his hand reached for my face, a deafening explosion shook the room. One of the walls blew inward, showering us with concrete and metal. Through the dust and debris, figures emerged. Hospital security, but armed like a military unit. "Get down!" a familiar voice bellowed. Clint Reeves stood in the breach, wielding what looked like a flamethrower. Behind him came Marge, Doctor, Kane, and a dozen others, all armed, all wearing modified marker bracelets that glowed intense blue. "Fire in the hole!" Clint shouted, before unleashing a torrent of flame directly at the hollow. The darkness shrieked, a sound that existed more in my mind than my ears, and recoiled from the fire. My captors released me, turning to face the new threat, but they were immediately cut down by precise gunfire from Marge and the others. "Bobby!" Marge shouted over the chaos. "Get out of the pattern!" I scrambled to my feet, trying to flee, but Not Bowman lunged for me, his form now barely recognizable as human. "You won't escape us," he snarled, his voice a distorted chorus. "You belong to us." A blue beam of energy struck him squarely in the chest, sending him staggering backward. Dr. Kane stood with some kind of advanced weapon, his face set in grim determination. "Move, Roberts!" he barked. "Now!" I ran, dodging tendrils of darkness as the hollow fought back against Clint's flames. The glowing pattern beneath my feet pulsed angrily, sections beginning to fade as the ritual was disrupted. Holt screamed orders to her remaining suited figures, who were engaged in close combat with the security team. "Protect the convergence. We can't lose him now." I reached the edge of the pattern, just as a massive tremor shook the room. Cracks appeared in the floor and walls, widening rapidly. The ceiling began to collapse, huge chunks of concrete falling into the pattern. "The whole place is coming down," someone shouted. "Fall back." Marge grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the exit. "We need to move. The charges are set to collapse this entire section." "Charges? You planned this?" I gasped as we ran. "Contingency plan," she replied breathlessly. "In case the convergence actually started. We've been waiting for years, hoping it wouldn't come to this." We raced through corridors that were rapidly deteriorating, joining others fleeing toward the emergency exits. Behind us, I could hear inhuman shrieks of rage and the continuing sounds of combat. "Who are you people?" I demanded as we ran. "You're not just hospital staff." "Later," Marge promised, "if we survive." We burst through an emergency exit into a stairwell, climbing toward the surface. My enhanced bracelet was still glowing crimson, though the light seemed to be fading gradually. As we reached the main floor, a final massive explosion rocked the building. The stairwell behind us collapsed entirely, dust and debris billowing upward in a choking cloud. We emerged into the night air, gasping and coughing. Around us, hospital staff and patients were being evacuated, loaded into ambulances and buses. Police and fire vehicles surrounded the building, their lights casting red and blue patterns across the chaos. I turned to look back at Riverside General. The main structure appeared intact, but smoke poured from ventilation shafts, and the ground around the building had cracked and subsided in places. "Did we stop it?" I asked Marge, who stood beside me watching the destruction. "The convergence?" She gave me a tired smile. "For now, but they'll try again. They always do." "Who will? Holt? Patient 34B?" "All of them," she replied grimly. "The ones who want the door opened, and the ones who want to come through." I looked down at my bracelet, its crimson glow now just a faint pulse. "And what happens to me now?" Marge's expression softened. "That depends on you, Bobby. On which side of the door you want to stand." 3 months later, I stood at the shore of Hawkins Lake, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of orange and gold. The air was crisp with early autumn, leaves just beginning to turn on the trees surrounding the quiet water. I hadn't been back here since Tommy drowned 20 years ago. The place looked smaller than I remembered, less imposing. The wooden dock where we used to fish had been replaced with a newer one, but otherwise time seemed to have left this place untouched. "Thought I might find you here," came a voice from behind me. I turned to see Marge approaching, hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. She looked different out of uniform, more human somehow, less the stern charge nurse I'd known for years. "How'd you know where to look?" I asked. She tapped her wrist, where a slim blue bracelet glowed faintly. I glanced down at my own, identical to hers now, the crimson long faded. "Perks of the job," she said with a small smile. "Or burden, depending on how you look at it." After the destruction of the sub-levels of Riverside General, I'd been given a choice: walk away with my memories wiped, or join what Marge called the real work. The organization had no name, at least none she would share with me. They operated in the shadows, monitoring and containing entities like Patient 34B and the Hollow, preventing convergences like the one that had nearly happened. I'd chosen to join, partly out of a desire to understand what had happened to me, and partly because I wasn't sure I could ever go back to normal life, knowing what I now knew. "Any word on Holt?" I asked, skipping a stone across the calm surface of the lake. "Still in the wind," Marge replied, "along with about half of the board of directors. We've identified cells in 3 other hospitals across the country. Clint's team is dealing with them." I nodded, not entirely surprised. The conspiracy had run deeper than any of us had initially realized. Doctors, administrators, government officials, all working toward the convergence, believing it would grant them power or knowledge or immortality, none of them understanding what would really come through if the door was fully opened. And Patient 34B? The Hollow? Contained. New facility, better safeguards. Marge joined me at the water's edge. But not destroyed. They can't be. Not completely. Not while the connection exists. The connection. My connection. Whatever made me a doorway, a key, It was still inside me, dormant but present. Dr. Kane's tests had confirmed it was genetic, passed down through generations of my family. Tommy had had it too. It might have been why he'd drowned that day, drawn to something beneath the surface of this very lake. "Do you think they'll try again?" I asked quietly. "They always do," Marge replied, echoing her words from that night. "But we'll be ready, and so will you." My training had been intense, learning to recognize the signs of infiltration, to resist mental influence, to use the marker bracelet as a tool rather than just a shield. I'd discovered abilities I never knew I had, ways to sense the entities before they fully manifested. "I still dream about him sometimes," I admitted. "Tommy, except it's not really him. The entities use our deepest connections, our greatest pain," Marge said gently. "That won't stop, but you can learn to tell the difference between their manipulations and your real memories." I took a deep breath of the cool lake air. "Is that why you brought me here? To face it?" "Partly," she acknowledged, "but also because it's time you knew the whole truth." She nodded toward the center of the lake. "About what's really down there." I followed her gaze to the still water, reflecting the darkening sky. "There's something in the lake?" "There's something under every lake, Bobby. Every cave, every deep place, waiting, calling. Most people can't hear it. But people like you and Tommy, you've always heard it, whether you realized it or not." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Is that why he drowned? Something called him in?" Marge nodded solemnly. "And it's been calling you back ever since. Patient 34B, the Hollow. They're just fragments, echoes of what lies beneath, what lies between worlds." I stared out at the peaceful lake, trying to reconcile its innocent appearance with the horror Marge described. Part of me wanted to turn and run, to forget everything again, but a deeper part knew she was right. I'd always felt drawn to this place, even while fearing it. "So what now?" I asked. "Now, you follow the rules," she said simply. "New rules, better ones, rules that protect rather than prepare." From her pocket, she produced a small leather-bound notebook and handed it to me. Inside, written in neat handwriting, was a list. 1. Never remove your marker bracelet. It is your identity, your shield, and your weapon. 2. Report any dreams or visions immediately, no matter how insignificant they seem. 3. Avoid bodies of standing water larger than a bathtub, especially at night. 4. If you hear your name called by a voice you don't recognize, do not respond and leave the area immediately. 5. Never look into a reflective surface for more than 30 seconds continuously. 6. If your bracelet changes color unexpectedly, activate the emergency protocol and proceed to the nearest safe location. 7. Remember, they can wear familiar faces, but they cannot reproduce love. This is how you tell what's real. I closed the notebook, running my fingers over its worn cover. "Will these keep me safe?" Marge smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "No, Bobby. Nothing can keep any of us completely safe, but they'll give you a fighting chance." As darkness fell over Hawkins Lake, we turned and walked back toward the parking lot, leaving the water and whatever lay beneath it behind. For now. The rules had changed, but the night shift continued, and I would be ready,